Hi, this is Muho, and I want to continue with the My Teacher's House series. Last time I talked about my time in the priest seminary, or in Japanese it's called Sodo, the training monastery where you have to go to get your license. First I went for 1 year into a Rinzai monastery, after that I went to Hoshinji. And after that, I came back to Antaiji for 4 years. And 18 years ago, in 2002, my teacher died in an accident. And at that time, I had left Antaiji. I had left Antaiji in the summer before 2001. And before I left Antaiji, the relation between my teacher, Mia Roshi, and my teacher's teacher, which is Watanabe Roshi, got gradually worse. And I had been in contact with my teacher's teachers, with Watanabe Roshi. For the first time I had heard about Watanabe Roshi when I visited Antaiji in 1990, when I was 22. And at that time I spent 6 months at Antaiji, and the monks there, all of them knew Watanabe Roshi. Some of them had been ordained by Watanabe Roshi. Some of them still thought about Watanabe Roshi as their true teacher. So some of them recommended that when I go back to Germany, I should visit Watanabe Roshi, who at the time lived in Italy. And I did that in, I think it was the summer of 1991, maybe 1992. And then the following year, 1993, I got back to Antaiji, ordained there, and for a long time I didn't have any contact with Watanabe Roshi. But then, that's the next question of Edward, I saw Watanabe Roshi again for the first time in 5 years after I left Hoshinji, so after the second year in a training monastery. Before I got back to Antaiji, I traveled around Japan, and I had heard that Watanabe Roshi had gotten back to Japan from Italy. The reason was that he was diagnosed with cancer, and I think the doctor told him originally that he didn't have much more time to live, so he decided to move back to Japan with his family and die in Japan. But then after 3 years or so, he still was alive and kicking, so he took over a temple in southern Japan, Wakayama, which is in the south of Antaiji. I had heard about that, and I decided to give him a call and then visit him. So Edward, in today's section, first asks, when did your exchange with Watanabe start after Hoshinji? So there was a small exchange already in Italy, and I wrote to him after I had visited him in Italy. I wrote him from Kyoto when I was still studying there. But the real exchange, intense exchange, started after I left Hoshinji. My answer, yes, after Hoshinji I visited Antaiji, but also did a takuhatsu trip through central Japan. I think 3 weeks or so before I got back to Antaiji. I traveled with the train, and wherever I got off I did some begging and stayed in temples most of the time overnight, and then I went further through central Japan, through the so-called Japanese Alps and down to Nagoya. I wanted to visit it. Well, actually, I don't think I visited Nagoya. I went through the Japanese Alps to Matsumoto and well, maybe I think I was passing through Nagoya, and then I visited one of the last surviving disciples of Sawaki Roshi, who lives in Mie, and from there I went down to Wakayama to see Watanabe Roshi. I wanted to visit places that I had heard of. At the time, I had also heard that Watanabe had come back to Japan from Italy. He was living in Wakayama. At first, I called his temple, and he said, "No, I'm retired." But then he asked, "Do you happen to be that guy I met in Italy?" I said, "Yeah, that's me." So he said, "Oh, then please come, let's have some sake and go to the onsen." So those are the Japanese hot springs. That was after Hosshinji in the autumn of 1997. The next year, Uchiyama died, and I visited Watanabe at least twice during the winter. Whenever the Japanese guys went home for the winter, I usually visited Watanabe. So in Antaiji, we had these 3-week holidays. Usually they started on December 20th or 21st, and they went until January 9th. And all of the Japanese monks would use the opportunity to visit their parents if they were still alive. It's kind of Japanese tradition to visit your parents. If you have the time in summer, then you would do it in the middle of August, and then again at New Year's. While I usually went to do begging at the time. And if I had the possibility, if I had the, how do you say, the chance at the time, I also would see Watanabe in the winter. It was normal before New Year's when I did takuhatsu. After Uchiyama died, which was in 1998, March of 1998, the relationship between Watanabe and Miyaura got bad, but I didn't notice it at the beginning. In retrospect, I can see that the death of Uchiyama triggered something in Watanabe. People have been speculating what it was exactly between Miyaura and his teacher Watanabe that caused the conflict, and I don't know. I haven't heard any good explanations, but some people say, well, it was Uchiyama's death that has something to do with it. Maybe Watanabe, after his mission in Italy, didn't succeed in the way that maybe he expected. He wanted to go back to Antaiji, but as long as Uchiyama was alive, he couldn't possibly do that. But then after Uchiyama Roshi had died, some people say, well, now he was basically the head of the tradition, so he thought that he could do whatever he wanted. While my teacher, Miyaura Roshi, who was a student, wouldn't let him do whatever he wanted with Antaiji. Edward asks, this kind of criticism drove him to drink heavily. So here he's referring to Miyaura's drinking and asks if it was because of the criticism he got from his teacher Watanabe. My answer, I think so. Though Watanabe was drinking heavily himself, and they say Sawaki's last words on the deathbed were "sake," I want to drink sake, or something like that. Uchiyama said, I think it was in one of his books, I forgot which it was, Uchiyama said he doesn't drink so much, but because he has cold feet, he enjoys 3 shots of whiskey before sleeping. There's always been a good amount of drinking at Antaiji. I mean, compared to now, it was nothing to what it was in the past. I don't really understand my English here myself, but what I'm trying to say is that, well, even now at Antaiji we drink from time to time. Often there's a party after the session, and recently in Antaiji some people are making rice, wine, sake by themselves, beer even. But some people are surprised when they come to the Zen monastery and say, how is it possible that you drink alcohol here? But even though we drink now, in the past, I think there was much more, according to the rumors I hear. Or even when I came first to Antaiji, there was much more drinking. But yeah, I guess it was this conflict, the conflict between Watanabe and Miyaura, that caused him to drink more than maybe was good for him. Even without Watanabe, you are in the position I am in now, basically being the abbot, being responsible for the monastery. At the beginning of your 50s in Antaiji, so where in secular society you would, or some people would have their midlife crisis. You ask yourself, you look back at your life. Basically, well, I'm 51 now. It's a point in your life, from my perspective, where you don't think anymore that anything is possible. Probably when you're 30 or so, you're still unlimited possibilities. With 50, that are still, I mean, you still have probably 30 years ahead of you. Of course, you could die anytime, as happened to my teacher. You could die any time, but if you live to the average Japanese life expectancy, you still have 30 years to go, but you don't have unlimited possibilities anymore. So when you look at your life at that point, you start to realize that, or sometimes I use this metaphor. You throw a ball, and when you just thrown the ball and you still see it rising, it could be a home run, maybe. But then at some point when it starts to sink again, you can see, or even though it's still falling, you can see in which area it's probably gonna drop, and you can see, oh, this is not a home run. This is not gonna be, well, if it was soccer, for example, it's not gonna hit the goal in any way. So that's what it can feel like to be in your early 50s. There's still a good amount of your life ahead of you, but you get an idea of how your life is gonna look like. So Watanabe was in this position that I am in now, and talking about me being the abbot of Antaiji in 2019. At the beginning of your 50s, and there's only 3 students. I was usually fortunate enough to have more than that, but, well, sometimes there were even less, and it's hard with only 3 people. And around half of the people left before that because Miyaura had this intention with money. So I was talking about the money problem in some of the previous uploads. At one point Miyaura told us, it's up to you how you make sure that Antaiji can survive financially, can do anything to make money. The only thing I don't want you to do is to go begging. And until then, begging was always what people would do if there wasn't enough money in the temple register. So after that, a lot of people left. Although Miaula's idea with that, I think for him it was something like a koan, to make people get serious about the practice. Either way, people left. But then the bills needed to be paid. Maybe something needed to be done about the buildings, repairs. He wasn't getting younger. Miaula wasn't getting younger. He had his wife, but no children. What would happen to him and his wife at old age? What would happen with Antaiji? Nobody knew the answer. So nobody really got old at Antaiji. I mean, Sawaki Roshi retired in Antaiji when he was in his 80s. Before that, he lived in Tokyo, but then Uchiyama retired when he was 65, and when Watanabe Roshi retired, he was in his early 40s. My teacher died then when he was 52, 53. Antaiji, especially the present Antaiji in the present location, isn't really a place to get old. And you start to feel that when you're in your 50s. But then again, there were only 3 students, and I don't think that my teacher felt that any of these 3, including myself, would be able to take over Antaiji in the near future. So what would become of Antaiji? Then Watanabe appeared and said, "You're doing it all wrong." If he had said, "Well, if you do it like this, things will improve," that would have been nice. But he was like, "With you at Antaiji, it's never going to work out. Look at the mess you created during these 10 years. I don't see any disciples. Maybe I can just use Muho to run things instead." Well, I doubt that was the way he said it, but well, at one point he came up with my name, obviously, and said, "Well, why don't you give the place to Muho?" Miaula could have said, "Okay, if you say so, I'm going to retire." But maybe he felt it was irresponsible to do. And perhaps he thought, well, what has Watanabe done in those 10 years that he was the abbot? So Watanabe, he was 12 years the abbot, from 1975 to 1987. And in 1977 he moved the place to the present location, and then for 10 years he ran the place. But then he gave all of the responsibility to Miaula Roshi. So Miaula Roshi could have, and maybe actually did, ask his teacher, "Well, you criticize me for the job I'm doing, but what did you do during those 10 years? So Watanabe, he had money, spent the money, then went to Italy. When he sold the property in Kyoto, at first there were kind of, in dollars, it would be millions of dollars that he had, and that allowed him to buy the place and to build up the buildings and buy machinery. But then when he left, there was no money. So it's a different thing to run the place with money and to run the place without money. When his doctor told him he had cancer, he gave up his mission in Italy, which never sparked anything. When he went to Italy, there was this idea, now we're gonna spread the gospel. We're gonna take Antaiji style Zen to Europe. But unlike Shunryu Suzuki in America and unlike Deshimaru in Europe, Watanabe in Italy, he didn't really spark something like that. And came back to Wakayama and is sitting there telling me I'm not doing a good job. What has he done? That is what I would have said. I see things are not running the way they should be running, but who had the idea to build Antaiji in this place where there is no income and it is hard for people to stay? There was no real vision. Maybe the alcohol helped Miyaura to forget that for a while. I mean, there's also the theory that the reason for the accident when he died was that he drank too much the night before. So it was the night of the February 13th, 2002. There was a party for that guest who had come, whose car he pulled down to the bus stop the next day. That guest had come with a car, and it started to snow after that, so he couldn't return with his car. That's why Miyaura decided on the 14th to pull him in his car down to the bus stop with a bulldozer. The New Year's card that he sent out that year was for the year of the horse. He had painted a picture of a horse lying down and drinking a bottle of sake. Happy New Year, everyone. He was in this sake mode. Some people say he was drinking too much, so he went down there with a hangover, not enough sleep, and maybe he had a heart attack from that. Well, that's also just another theory. Fact is that he went with a bulldozer 4 kilometers down the mountain. He pulled the guest's car. He saw him off when he had reached the roads, and then he turned, and the only thing he needed to do is just follow the tracks that he left with the bulldozer when he came down. But the first curve, which isn't really a very how do you say, steep curve, it's not a big turn or anything. For some reason he didn't make a turn there, but he went straight into the river, and nobody knows why. It's only a few minutes from the bus stop, so it's hard to imagine that he fell asleep at that point, although it's possible. But then what other explanations would there be? It could be a heart attack. Some people have speculated that maybe he drove in there on purpose. Maybe he was suicidal. Who knows? Edward's next question. Edward, when you had this realization that you wanted to return to Miyaura, what came into your mind? So now we're talking about 4 years before that accident, 1997, when I came back from Hosshinji to Antaiji. I mean, I could have stayed in Hosshinji, for example. I could have gone back to the Rinzai temple. I could have gone anywhere else. There wasn't really a need to go back to Antaiji. What made me return to Miyaura? So my answer to this question is, there's all this invisible stuff that people do for you that you only realize much later. Sometimes you have this with your parents or a girlfriend you broke up with. With Miyaura, I had always been kind of complaining this, complaining that. But did I do my job? The answer was no. He showed me how to do practical things and stopped thinking. All of this very obvious stuff I just didn't realize. Where's the Dharma if you can't cook your udon noodles properly? He was trying to point me to it in very subtle ways sometimes. I just didn't have the eyes to see, the ears to listen. Yes, I felt trapped at Antaiji after 2 years. But he was the one who ordained me as a monk. He gave me the ropes, the kesa, my first rakusu, and I'd taken all of that for granted. Like with your parents, you never say thank you for anything, because you think it's a matter of course. that they take care of you. Some people have this thing that they think their parents owe them something for bringing them into the world in the first place. When I say some people there, that includes me, I'm afraid. It can be like that with your teacher, with a teacher. You ordain with them because you want to become a monk. You get 3 meals a day, you get rubber boots if you don't have any, you get everything pretty much, and I was still complaining. I didn't like the schedule, I didn't like hierarchy, I didn't like the fact I was Tenzo when I would rather have worked outside. I never said thank you for accepting me as a student. Thank you for giving me those robes. Thank you for letting me stay here in the monastery. I took that for granted, and I thought I was even entitled to complain. When I was at Tofukuji, I realized somewhere in the Zuimonki, there's this chapter that always strikes me. Maybe I'll put a link below. I forgot the chapter. I think it's somewhere 513 in that area. Dogen is quoting Dai, which is a Rinzai Zen master that lived about 100 years before the time when Dogen studied in China. He's quoting Dai from China, saying you should practice as if you had a debt you can never repay. If you have that attitude, you can understand this phrase. The perfect way is never hard to accomplish. You just have to stop picking and choosing. That's the beginning of a sutra or text that's called Shinjin Me. In Japanese, the inscription of faith in mind, I think it's sometimes translated in the first sentence of this sutra is Shido Bunan. The perfect way is easy to attain. It's not difficult to attain. It's just that you need to stop picking and grasping. And Dai again says, to realize this, you need to have this attitude there's a debt that you can never possibly repay. Dogen says you need to have this attitude that I owe the world something and I will never be able to repay that. If you have that attitude, why would you pick and choose and say I prefer a Western breakfast to a Japanese breakfast? Why can't we have spaghetti? Why can't I have my Satori? Why do I have to be the Tenzo? Why does nobody appreciate me? Why did my parents have me in the first place? All of it becomes ridiculous, and that was the Tofukuji realization I had. How ridiculous I was. That's what led me to feel that I owed something to Miyaula. I never felt the same gratitude to the guys in Tofukuji because I maybe felt sometimes that they got a sadistic pleasure out of treating me the way they did. Well, not all of them, but the gratitude I felt in Tofukuji for some reason was directed towards my teacher and the monks at Antaiji. Even though, fortunately, it helped me in the end, what I experienced in Tofukuji. But it could also have broken and traumatized me. At Antaiji, I never had the feeling that people took pleasure in making me feel miserable. I actually felt that in these 2 years, they did a lot to help me without myself even realizing that. Yeah. So much for today. I will put a link to that piece in the Zui Monkey where Dogen Zenji is quoting Zen Master Dai from China. I always find that interesting because sometimes when we Westerners talk about why we came into Buddhism and, for example, not stick with Christianity. Well, in my case, I was baptized when I was still a baby, and then at age 14 I was confirmed, I think it's called in English as well. So I chose Christianity at that point as my religion, but I didn't stick with it. And some people give as one of the reasons that in Christianity there's this feel of guilt or original sin. Well, in Buddhism you don't have that. In Buddhism you don't have this idea that we're originally sinful creatures. So of course Buddha didn't die for our sins, while it sometimes said that Jesus did died on the cross for our sins. Buddhism teaches that we are all in delusion, but Buddhism doesn't teach that we are sinful. We are more or less okay as we are. It's just that we have to wake up to that fact that we're already Buddhas. We have to wake up to the fact that we are Buddhas and just have to practice that. So I find it interesting that although in Buddhism on the whole there's not so much talk about sin, at that point in the Zui Monkey, at least, Dogen explicitly talks about this debt. There's a debt that you can impossibly pay back. He gives even the amount of the debt, Semman Kan. I don't know how much that would be in the current currency, but I would say it's maybe $3 billion or even $3 trillion. So it's not, if it was $1 million, if it was $1 million, then you could say, okay, give me 30 years and I'll make that amount of money. I'll work, I'll start a business, I have a business idea, I'll make that amount of money. The point is that we can never, ever pay back for the fact that we are here. And of course the question is, do you actually appreciate that? For a long time in my life I never really appreciated that. It was probably only in Tofuguji that I had this first realization, or actually it's wonderful, it's a miracle to be here. Before, for me it was more like a curse. The curse became a miracle. And only in that moment you think about paying back the impossible. And then, of course, you stop complaining. You stop complaining and saying, yeah, can I have, please, my dessert? Where's my dessert? Can I have a second cup of coffee, please? You stop with that, and that's what is meant with the way is easy to attain. It means basically to realize, wow, I'm here in this moment. I'm here in the now. Right now I'm here. And I took that for granted and was even asking for pocket money. Yeah, maybe so much for today. Below the video you find a link to the text, and I will also put a link to the Zuimonki chapter. You can find the whole Zuimonki in English on the Soto Zen website. And see you again next time.